Wow. Okay. Well, you know, one of the things that I think gets people lose sight of is that markets are very, very, very much a product of human beings. We create markets, we create the incentives, and they either work big for entrepreneurs or they don't. So I'm going to tell you a story about how we need to take back our markets, how we're in the first inning of taking back our markets, and I want to turn every single one of you into an activist evangelist to help me reinvigorate the world's economy and to solve the problems for the next generation, massive problems. You need education, you need entrepreneurship, you also need capital. In 1971, there was a really little company, was only 3 years old. Today, you have to be 8, 9 years old typically to be able to take a company public. This company went public on NASDAQ. It was the first year that the NASDAQ stock market came into existence. Okay? They missed delivery of their first product out of the box. They were not profitable on an operating basis. And that stock for that $8 million IPO, that teeny tiny IPO, got cut in half. Okay? That company today couldn't get public. Okay? And it then had a $4 million float, even adjusting for inflation. Okay? That would be a teeny tiny company that couldn't get public in today's marketplace. Do you know what company that was? That was the Intel Corporation. Okay, today they created over 100,000 jobs, but more importantly, the semiconductor industry has transformed the world. It's created the personal computer industry, our wireless industry, the fields of genomics. Semiconductors are enablers, enabling technology that are making the world a better place. And so, when we look at small business, and you think about your children, we all start small. Okay? You have to feed them. They're our future. Thomas Edison was small. Steve Jobs was small. I'm going to tell you a quick story about Steve Jobs. When I was vice chairman of NASDAQ, about how even brilliant people don't see things, and how something about capital markets was missed, I think, by the entirety of the United States, including myself at one point. Steve called me on the phone. I picked up the phone, and he said, David, I just learned that NASDAQ is standardized on nothing but Dell computers. And I'm going to take the listing over to the New York Stock Exchange. And I sort of started doing the moonwalk, and I said, because you can imagine how catastrophic that would be for NASDAQ to have one of our NASDAQ 100 companies move over to the New York Stock Exchange. And I said, well, look, I mean, actually, we love the Mac. It's in the graphics department. But we've got tons of people that work for us that are on these BlackBerries, and they need their remote email. And so I got into a discussion very quick. It was interesting. I mean, to Steve's credit, he backed off, and he said, oh, that's interesting. I said, yeah, people are living on remote email. He didn't know that. So we spent the next 30 minutes sort of in a focus group of one trying to understand what was going on with remote email. This was probably around 2001, if memory serves me correctly, a long time ago. You know, the rest is history. But here is one of the most important innovators of our time, and he was kind of late to the party about wireless email. Okay? In the United States, 64% of all net new jobs are created by small business. Okay? If you go back to 1960, our economy started literally 16 million, created 16 million net new jobs. The 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, we created 18 to 22 million net new jobs every single decade, like clockwork. Then all of a sudden, in the decade of the 2000s, poof, nothing. In fact, we lost 1.5 million jobs. We're missing, on the order from just that decade alone, 25 million jobs. And if you look at it, you know, people are always point to something like the credit crisis. The credit crisis The financial crisis of 2007, 2008, what we know as the Great Recession, was probably responsible for about 8 million of it. But if you go back to the early part of the decade, we were already in trouble. Even with a housing boom going on, we were not creating jobs the way we had historically. So I'm going to talk to you right now about small IPOs. Remember, everything starts small. And if we don't get capital into the hands of small business, we have a problem. Okay. Now, this is a chart that actually was put up in the House Subcommittee on Capital Markets. And it's a transformative slide. What you see in the green tranche is the smaller than $50 million IPO going back to 1991. And what you see in the yellow tranche is the larger IPOs. And what you see is that in 1998, the small IPO fell off a cliff in the United States. It used to be clearly 80% of all IPOs. Remember, there's a lot more small companies than large companies. And all of a sudden, the bar got raised. And we ended up with 20% of all IPOs being sub $50 million, and it's never recovered. Well, what happened in 1998 is we transitioned wholesale from telephone-quoted markets with large incentives, quarter-point spreads, big commissions, to electronic, highly efficient markets that all of a sudden didn't pay enough to support retail brokers and keep the incentives going for Wall Street. And we started an entire collapse of the ecosystem that was required to support small IPOs in this country. Now, going back to the thing that was not obvious, this was not obvious because it was during the dot-com bubble. Okay? Everybody thought that everything was wonderful. Everybody blamed Sarbanes-Oxley, which didn't happen until 2002, higher costs for companies going public. In point of fact, what they didn't understand was that the problem started 4 years before Sarbanes-Oxley. So where are we going? Well, today we have 7 billion people in the world. By the year 2050, we will have 10 billion people in the world. And we have massive problems that we have to solve. Global warming, energy consumption, pollution, disease, unemployment, which can destabilize entire nations, as we've seen in the Middle East and elsewhere, poverty. Okay? The only way we're going to solve these problems is by getting capital into the hands of entrepreneurs and scientists who will create the solutions for the next generation. How bad is it? Well, here's a chart that looks at the number of listed companies. And it compares Asia, which is on top in blue, listed companies being the number of public companies on the major stock markets. Compares Asia, Europe, and the United States in red. Now, I've done some work for the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, and what I can tell you is that our hyper-efficient, low-cost electronic market structures are undermining capital formation throughout the globe. We're exporting this model globally, and it's starting to show up in foreign countries as well, not just in the United States. But we're the first, and we're sort of ground zero for where this problem occurred. And if you look at this listing, what you start to determine is on the far left, 1975, we actually had more public companies listed in the United States than we have today. We've lost, since the peak in 1998, we've lost 50% of all publicly listed companies. Can you hear that whoosh? That's the sound of jobs fleeing the United States. Now, it may not be the entirety of the missing 25 million jobs, but as sure as I'm sitting here, it's a major chunk. So we started working pretty hard socializing these ideas. TED's a terrific opportunity to get this word out to the world, because ultimately it's not about me. It's about you being an agent for change. It takes a village. So we got people engaged in this issue. And congressmen, 6 of them in particular, wrote their own bits of legislation. And then ultimately that legislation, each of these individual bills, was pulled under an omnibus act called the Jobs Act, the Jumpstart Our Business Startups Act. And it's giving birth to crowdfunding, to general solicitation and private placements. It's totally changing the way that we look at raising capital. It's doing work in the IPO market by making it more cost-effective for companies to go public. Okay? This is better on-ramps. But this is the tip of the iceberg of the solution that we need, because once companies go public, where are they going? Do they drop off a cliff and not get supported in public markets? So the big opportunity going forward is to create the Jobs Act 2, the Jobs Act 3, to use technology, which is what we're focused on, to get into something called the long tail of the distribution curve. Because what happens when you take economic incentive out of the equation? You end up with a stock market where Wall Street can only afford to cover the top 100 institutional investors effectively that now generate 80% of the commissions. If you've read Chris Anderson's book called The Long Tail, I'd recommend it to you. Essentially, what happened in stock markets is large investors focus on large companies. Small investors, which there are many, many more of, 3,000 institutional small investors in the United States, don't get covered, but they focus on small companies. So if you want to bring access to capital down to small companies again, to unleash the power of entrepreneurship in the United States and the world, we need to be able to reach that part of the marketplace. We can do that with higher incentives in the aftermarket, which is what we're working on with Washington. It's called higher tick sizes, and the SEC is now crafting a pilot. But we can also do it through technology to better market to the vast numbers of investors that are in the so-called long tail. Do yourself a favor. Do your children a favor. Don't take capital markets for granted. Make sure that they're working not for high-frequency trading and large-cap folks that are trading themselves silly, but make sure that they're working for the entrepreneur. So if you want to solve global warming, you want to find the cure to AIDS, the cure to Alzheimer's, we need capital in the hands of entrepreneurs. My grandmother was a frontline nurse in World War I. It was before the age of antibiotics. 50% of the wounded died from infection. The world's been transformed, but it took capital. We had better stock markets in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. We ruined them, okay? It's time for each and every one of us to take back our destiny and paint a brighter picture for the next generation. Thank you.